On February 20th, 1959, workers at Avro Canada's sprawling facility near Toronto watched in disbelief as cutting torches began destroying 5 completed CF-105 Arrow interceptors, the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2 and altitudes above 60,000 feet. The Canadian government had just canceled the program after investing hundreds of millions of dollars, and Prime Minister John Diefenbaker ordered the aircraft destroyed immediately to prevent any possibility of salvage or sale. What followed was the dismantling of Canada's aerospace industry and a national trauma that Canadians still debate more than 60 years later.
Cold War ambitions in the frozen North. In the early 1950s, Canada faced a unique strategic challenge. As the northernmost nation in NATO and sharing the Arctic frontier with the Soviet Union, Canada lay directly beneath the flight paths that Soviet bombers would follow to attack the United States. The shortest route from Soviet air bases to American cities crossed over Canadian territory, making Canada the front line of continental air defense. The threat was taken seriously. Soviet T-95 Bear bombers could carry nuclear weapons across the Arctic, and by the mid-1950s, the USSR was developing even more capable bombers that could fly higher and faster. Intercepting these aircraft before they reached populated areas required fighters that could operate in the extreme conditions of the Canadian North, climb rapidly to intercept high-altitude bombers, and carry enough fuel to patrol vast distances. The Royal Canadian Air Force's existing interceptors, American-designed F-86 Sabres and CF-100 Canucks, were adequate for the early 1950s but would soon be obsolete. Canada needed a next-generation interceptor, and the question was whether to purchase American aircraft or develop a Canadian design. Avro Canada Limited, commonly known as Avro Canada, was the country's premier aerospace manufacturer. The company had successfully produced the CF-100 Canuck interceptor, demonstrating that Canada possessed indigenous design and manufacturing capabilities. Avro's chief designer, James Floyd, was a brilliant British engineer who had worked on advanced aircraft during World War II before emigrating to Canada. Floyd and his team believed they could create the world's most advanced interceptor, an aircraft that would not just meet Canadian requirements, but surpass anything the Americans or British were developing. "We're not just building an interceptor," Floyd told his design team during early planning sessions. "We're creating the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. This will be Canada's aircraft, designed here, built here, proving that Canadian engineering can match or exceed anything the Americans produce." This ambition, while inspiring, contained the seeds of the program's eventual destruction. The Arrow would be competing not just with American designs, but with the entire American aerospace industry, an industry with vastly greater resources, deeper experience, and government support that dwarfed anything Canada could provide.
Design challenges and technical hubris. The Arrow design that took shape through 1954 and 1955 was radical and sophisticated. The aircraft would be large for a fighter, weighing more than 60,000 pounds fully loaded, powered by 2 afterburning turbojet engines, and featuring a delta wing optimized for high-speed, high-altitude flight. The avionics suite would include sophisticated radar, fire control systems, and integration with missiles that were still under development in the United States. Every aspect of the design pushed technological boundaries, and several required developing entirely new capabilities. The engines posed the first major challenge. No existing engine could provide the power required for the Arrow's performance specifications. Avro negotiated with various manufacturers and eventually settled on the Pratt & Whitney J75, a powerful American turbojet engine being developed for other high-performance aircraft. But the J75, while powerful, wasn't optimized for the Arrow's specific requirements. Avro decided to develop an indigenous engine, the Iroquois, that would provide superior performance. The Iroquois represented an enormous technical challenge, requiring Canadian engineers to match or exceed American engine technology that had been developed over decades with massive investment. The Iroquois engine will be the most powerful turbojet in the world when completed, boasted the chief engine designer. This confidence, while based on theoretical calculations, ignored the enormous gap between design and reality in jet engine development. Even experienced American and British manufacturers struggled with jet engine reliability, and Canada was attempting to leapfrog them with limited experience and resources. The avionics systems presented even greater challenges. The Arrow required sophisticated radar capable of detecting bomber-sized targets at ranges exceeding 50 miles, fire control computers to calculate intercept courses and weapon employment, and integration with missiles that were still under development. This level of systems integration was at the frontier of 1950s electronics technology, requiring miniaturized components, reliable systems, and software that wouldn't exist in usable form for years. We're essentially trying to develop three cutting-edge systems simultaneously: the airframe, the engines, and the avionics, and integrate them into a functioning weapon system, observed Jim Chamberlain, Avro's chief aerodynamicist and one of the few voices warning about the program's technical risks. Any one of these would be a major undertaking. Doing all three at once while also developing new manufacturing processes and training a workforce is extraordinarily risky. Chamberlain's concerns were largely ignored. The program had enormous political momentum and nationalist fervor behind it. The Arrow would showcase Canadian technical prowess, provide high-tech employment, and prove that Canada could stand independent of American aerospace dominance. These political and psychological factors overrode careful technical and financial analysis.
The spiral of costs. As design work progressed through 1955 and 1956, costs began escalating beyond initial projections. The sophisticated systems required expensive development programs. Manufacturing the Arrow's complex airframe and systems demanded new tooling and facilities. Testing required building prototypes and conducting extensive flight trials. Each requirement added millions to the program's cost. By 1957, program costs had reached approximately $300 million, enormous for Canada's economy at the time, and the aircraft was still years from operational service. The Canadian government, under pressure to control defense spending, began questioning whether the Arrow represented good value or whether purchasing American interceptors might be more cost-effective. The debate became politically charged. Arrow supporters argued that cancellation would destroy Canada's aerospace industry and make Canada perpetually dependent on American technology. Opponents countered that Canada was investing hundreds of millions in a single aircraft program while neglecting other defense priorities, and that the Arrow's capabilities exceeded what Canada actually needed for continental defense. The first Arrow prototype rolled out on October 4, 1957, the same day the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. The timing was both perfect and terrible. Sputnik demonstrated the growing sophistication of Soviet technology, seeming to validate concerns about bomber threats. But it also heralded the age of intercontinental ballistic missiles, weapons that rendered interceptor aircraft obsolete for defending against strategic nuclear attack.
Why are we building the world's most advanced interceptor when the threat is shifting to missiles? Critics asked. Bombers can be intercepted. Missiles cannot. The Arrow is designed for yesterday's threat. Arrow supporters dismissed this argument. Bombers would remain part of Soviet strike forces for decades, they insisted. Missiles were expensive and limited in number. The bomber threat was real and would require interceptors like the Arrow for the foreseeable future. These arguments had merit, but ignored the strategic reality that missiles were indeed replacing bombers as the primary nuclear delivery system. The first Arrow flight occurred on March 25, 1958. Test pilot Jan Zurakovsky took the massive aircraft into the air from Avro's factory airfield, and the flight was successful beyond expectations. The Arrow handled beautifully, demonstrating stability and control that suggested the aerodynamic design was sound. Subsequent test flights pushed performance boundaries, with the Arrow reaching speeds exceeding Mach 1.9 and altitudes above 50,000 feet even without its intended engines or full avionics suite. "This aircraft flies like a dream," Zurakovsky reported after early flights. "It's stable, responsive, and has enormous potential. The performance we're seeing with interim engines and systems suggests that with the full avionics and Iroquois engines, this will indeed be the world's finest interceptor." The successful flight tests validated the aerodynamic design and demonstrated that Avro had created an aircraft of exceptional performance. But technical success couldn't overcome the political and financial realities that were dooming the program.
The political executioner. By late 1958, the Arrow program faced a perfect storm of problems. Costs had escalated to nearly $400 million, with production aircraft still years away. The Iroquois engine development was behind schedule and over budget. The avionics systems were proving even more challenging than anticipated, with contractors struggling to deliver components that met specifications. And the strategic justification for the aircraft was weakening as missiles increasingly replaced bombers. Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, elected in 1957, was skeptical of the Arrow from the beginning. A prairie populist with little understanding of or interest in aerospace technology, Diefenbaker saw the Arrow as an expensive boondoggle benefiting Toronto's aerospace industry while consuming resources that could be spent on other priorities. His government commissioned reviews of the program that consistently highlighted costs while downplaying capabilities. The final blow came from the United States. In 1958, the U.S. offered to provide Canada with Mach surface-to-air missiles and semi-automatic ground environment (SAGE) radar systems that would integrate Canadian air defense with American systems. The Americans argued this approach would provide better continental defense at lower cost than the Arrow program. The offer was politically poisonous. Accepting it meant acknowledging that Canada couldn't afford independent air defense and would become integrated into American systems. But the financial and strategic logic was compelling. The Mach-SAGE combination would cost a fraction of continuing the Arrow program while providing credible defense against the declining bomber threat. On February 20, 1959, Diefenbaker's government announced the immediate cancellation of the Arrow program. All work would cease immediately, all aircraft would be scrapped, and all tooling would be destroyed. The announcement was deliberately brutal, designed to eliminate any possibility of the program being revived by future governments or sold to other countries. "The Arrow program costs have become unsustainable," Diefenbaker announced. "The threat environment has changed, with missiles replacing bombers. Continuing this program would consume resources desperately needed for other defense priorities. The decision has been made to cancel the program completely." The reaction was immediate and devastating. More than 14,000 Avro employees were laid off within days. subcontractors throughout Canada faced cancellation of contracts that represented major portions of their business. Engineers and technicians, many of whom had been recruited internationally specifically for the Arrow program, found themselves suddenly unemployed in a specialized field with no Canadian opportunities. The destruction of the aircraft and tooling began immediately. Workers at Avro watched in shock as cutting torches sliced through the 5 completed Arrows and 2 prototypes. Tooling, jigs, technical drawings, and manufacturing equipment were destroyed or scrapped. The speed and thoroughness of the destruction suggested government paranoia that the program might somehow be revived or that foreign governments might purchase the aircraft. "They're not just canceling a program," one engineer observed bitterly as the destruction proceeded. "They're deliberately destroying Canada's aerospace capability. This isn't about saving money or changing strategy. This is about eliminating any possibility that Canadian aviation can challenge American dominance."
The myth and the reality. In the decades following cancellation, the Arrow became central to Canadian national mythology. The story evolved into a morality tale about Canadian achievement destroyed by short-sighted politicians bowing to American pressure. The Arrow was portrayed as the world's greatest fighter, decades ahead of its time, canceled just as it was proving its superiority. Conspiracy theories proliferated, suggesting American pressure, CIA involvement, or deliberate sabotage to eliminate competition for American aerospace companies. The reality was more complex and less flattering to Canadian nationalism. The Arrow was indeed an impressive aircraft with exceptional performance potential. But it was also extraordinarily expensive, designed for a threat that was declining, and represented capabilities that Canada didn't actually need and couldn't afford to operate. The unit cost projections for production Arrows ranged from $7 million to $12 million per aircraft, astronomical sums in late 1950s dollars. By comparison, the American F-106 Delta Dart, which entered service around the same time and provided similar capabilities, cost approximately $4 million per aircraft. The Arrow would have been one of the most expensive fighter aircraft in the world, and Canada planned to buy hundreds of them. The operational costs would have been equally daunting. The Iroquois engines, if they had been completed, would have required extensive maintenance and consumed fuel at prodigious rates. The sophisticated avionics would have needed specialized support equipment and highly trained technicians. Maintaining a fleet of Arrows would have consumed a huge portion of Canada's defense budget while providing capability primarily useful for intercepting bombers that were rapidly becoming obsolete. The program's technical achievements were real, but came at enormous cost and after enormous delays. The Iroquois engine had demonstrated good performance in ground testing, but was still years from being ready for operational service when the program was canceled. The avionics systems were proving far more difficult than anticipated, with integration challenges that would have required years more development. The Arrow that flew in 1958 was still far from being an operational weapon system. Claims that the Arrow was decades ahead of its time don't withstand scrutiny. Contemporary American aircraft, the F-106, the Navy's F-4 Phantom II, then under development, and various experimental aircraft matched or exceeded Arrow capabilities in most categories. The Arrow was advanced, but not revolutionary, impressive, but not unique. It represented excellent engineering applied to a very difficult problem, but it wasn't the technological miracle that mythology portrays.
The aftermath and lost opportunities. The cancellation's immediate effects were catastrophic for Canadian aerospace. Avro Canada ceased aircraft production and eventually dissolved.
thousands of engineers and technicians left Canada, many joining American aerospace companies or NASA. The brain drain was substantial. Former Arrow engineers worked on Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo spacecraft programs, F-15 and F-16 fighter development, and countless other projects that might have been Canadian if the industry hadn't been destroyed. The long-term effects were equally significant. Canada never again attempted to develop a frontline combat aircraft. The country's aerospace industry survived, but focused on regional aircraft, components manufacture, and licensed production of foreign designs. Canada became a Tier 2 aerospace nation, producing components and subsystems rather than complete aircraft. Politically, the Arrow cancellation contributed to Diefenbaker's government losing popularity and being defeated in 1963. The program became a symbol of lost potential and political short-sightedness, invoked by politicians of all parties as an example of government failure. The emotional resonance of the cancellation in Canadian political culture far exceeds the program's actual strategic or technical importance. The counter-argument that cancellation was the correct decision given financial and strategic realities has never gained traction in Canadian popular culture. Suggesting that the Arrow was too expensive or that its capabilities weren't needed is tantamount to attacking Canadian achievement and surrendering to American dominance. The mythology has become more powerful than facts.
The uncomfortable truths. Several truths about the Arrow remain politically uncomfortable for Canadians to acknowledge. First, the program was financially unsustainable. Canada's economy in the late 1950s simply couldn't support a program costing hundreds of millions of dollars for capabilities that provided marginal improvement over available alternatives. The money spent on the Arrow represented opportunity costs, defense capabilities, infrastructure, or social programs that were sacrificed to fund aircraft development. Second, the threat the Arrow was designed to counter was disappearing. Intercontinental ballistic missiles were replacing bombers as nuclear delivery systems. The Soviet Union was investing in missiles, not new bomber designs. Manned interceptors, however capable, were becoming obsolete for defending against strategic nuclear attack. The Arrow was an answer to yesterday's question. Third, Canada was attempting to match American aerospace capabilities with a fraction of American resources and experience. The United States in the 1950s possessed the world's most advanced aerospace industry, with dozens of companies, thousands of engineers, massive government funding, and decades of accumulated expertise. Canada had one major aircraft manufacturer, limited engineering talent, and defense budgets that were tiny compared to American spending. Expecting to produce aircraft superior to American designs under these conditions was unrealistic. Fourth, nationalism was a poor justification for weapons development. The desire to prove Canadian capability and independence from the United States drove continuation of a program that financial and strategic analysis suggested should be canceled. National pride doesn't make aircraft fly better or cost less, and basing defense procurement on emotional rather than rational criteria inevitably produces poor outcomes. Finally, the brain drain following cancellation was partially self-inflicted. Many engineers left Canada not just because the Arrow was canceled, but because Canada offered no other opportunities for advanced aerospace work. The country had concentrated its aerospace capabilities on a single program, and when that program ended, there was nothing for highly specialized engineers to transition to. A more balanced industrial policy would have prevented such concentration of capability in one program.
The enduring legacy. More than 60 years after its cancellation,
The Avro Arrow remains controversial in Canada. Museums display recovered fragments and full-scale replicas. Documentaries present the story as national tragedy. Politicians occasionally invoke the Arrow when discussing Canadian industrial policy or aerospace programs. The mythology has become embedded in Canadian national identity as a symbol of lost potential and American-dominated continental relationships. But the Arrow's real legacy is more ambiguous. The program demonstrated that Canada could design and build advanced aircraft, but at costs that were unsustainable and for purposes that were questionable. The cancellation destroyed Canadian aerospace capabilities, but those capabilities had been built around an unrealistic program that was always likely to fail financially even if it succeeded technically. The brain drain was significant, but it reflected Canada's inability to support advanced aerospace work at scale, not just the cancellation of one program. The comparison with other nations' experiences is instructive. Britain, France, and Sweden all developed indigenous fighters during the Cold War, and all faced similar cost escalations, performance compromises, and strategic questions about whether national programs made sense. Britain's TSR-2 strike aircraft, canceled in 1965, followed a similar trajectory to the Arrow, technically impressive but financially unsustainable. France's Mirage series succeeded by accepting more modest capabilities and finding export markets. Sweden's Viggen and Gripen fighters succeeded by designing specifically for Swedish requirements rather than attempting to build the world's best aircraft. The Arrow attempted to be the best interceptor in the world while serving a market of one country with limited defense budgets. This was always an impossible combination. Success would have required either accepting more modest capabilities, which would have made the aircraft less compelling, or finding export markets, which was politically impossible given American dominance and restrictions on technology transfer. Today, Canada operates F-35 Lightning II fighters, American aircraft purchased through international partnership. The decision generated controversy, with critics arguing Canada should develop indigenous aircraft or purchase European alternatives. But the financial realities that doomed the Arrow still apply. Canada cannot afford to independently develop advanced combat aircraft, and pooling resources with allies through international programs provides better capability at lower cost than national programs ever could. The Avro Arrow represents both the ambitions and limitations of Canadian aerospace. The engineers who designed it were talented and created an impressive aircraft, but they were attempting something that Canada's resources and strategic needs couldn't sustain. The program's cancellation was traumatic, but continuing it would have consumed resources for diminishing returns. The mythology that has grown around the Arrow obscures these uncomfortable realities, presenting a simple narrative of achievement destroyed by politics, when the truth was more complex and less flattering to Canadian self-image. The Arrow was not a betrayal or conspiracy. It was an ambitious program that exceeded what Canada could afford and what strategic circumstances justified. Its cancellation was brutal, but arguably necessary. The real tragedy wasn't that the program ended, but that Canada put so many resources into one single program, failed to develop more sustainable aerospace capabilities, and then allowed the cancellation to destroy the industry entirely rather than transitioning to more realistic ventures. More than 6 decades later, fragments of Arrow prototypes rest in museums, serving as monuments to what might have been. But they also stand as reminders that ambition without adequate resources, technical capability without strategic justification, and national pride without economic reality inevitably produce disappointment. The Arrow flew briefly and brilliantly before being destroyed, and in that, it became the perfect metaphor for the limits of mid-sized nations' aspirations to aerospace independence in the modern era.
If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so we can keep creating more content.